Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today I am joined by Jen Cross, and I cannot wait to talk to Jen because Jen and I talked a few weeks ago for her podcast, A Wild and Precious Life, and I, of course, will post in the show notes a link to her podcast for everyone listening. But Jen is a blogger. She's an author. She's a podcaster. She, of course, is so much more than that. So, Jen, for people who might not know you already, do you want to give yourself a brief introduction to the community?
Well, first of all, Crystal, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to get to talk to you again. I feel like we have just become fast friends. So it's a lot of fun to now be on your podcast. So my background is primarily that I started blogging way back when as a mommy blogger, and I've had several blogs throughout the years. I published my first book in 2017. It's called The Dallas Divorcee. It's a novel, really fun novel about women kind of going through life changes and set in my hometown of Dallas. Over the past few years, I found myself pivoting into more of sales positions and sales roles, and I really let my writing dwindle. And with the onset of COVID and everything that happened and spending a lot of time at home and being in a situation where I just wasn't really feeling fulfilled, I decided to get back to writing. I'd always had a second novel in my head, and I just felt like getting back in and exercising my writing muscles. So I started writing on Medium, and I began publishing articles on Medium about a variety of different topics, from practicing yoga to taking walks with my dog to veering all the way over into what I think should make people happy and what people need to do to have a happy life. And that writing evolved into someone suggesting that I create a podcast. And at first I was like, no, I don't think so. But I got bitten by the bug because I was interviewed for my writing on a podcast by Scott Davidson, who is pretty big in the podcast world. He's great. And from there, I thought, well, maybe I could do this. So from there, I created A Wild and Precious Life, the podcast that I had you on, and articles that I wrote on Medium, and I share those on the podcast. And then I invite guests on to speak about the broader themes of the article. We don't just go down to, bit by bit by the article, but it's people that, for instance, when I write about like maybe a traumatic event that I experienced in life and how it subsequently had me make some changes, I bring on a certified therapist in trauma. And we talk about in a greater sense of how other people can benefit from learning the steps I took to heal and what they can do in their own lives. So that's one of my big projects is doing that. However, that novel has been poking me. And it was a long ago manuscript I'd put away, partially done. And it's actually a very big pivot from The Dallas Divorcee. It is a children's fantasy book. And it is the story of a young girl, her best friend and brother, the little girl's brother, and they get dropped into another world. And I have reworked it, made it into with some more modern themes based on things going on today. And given my newly found ability to podcast, I decided that instead of going the traditional route with publishing like I did with The Dallas Divorcee, that I would drop Stella Daniels and the Guardians of Light as a serial podcast for kids, so that it's free, available literature for children, no matter where they live, no matter, what else they have going on. It will be a book available to them in serial form. So once a week, they'll listen to me read the story, and I'll leave them with some questions to think about that they can talk about with mom and dad if they listen to it on the carpool line or with their friends. So that's in a nutshell kind of what I have going on and where I am right now.
I absolutely love this. And I love this for a number of reasons. So one, you've decided to dive back into something you had sort of shelved, which I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast can relate to, because life gets busy. Things come up. We bump into fear a little bit when we try new things and we're like, I need to shelve that for a little while. But you've gone back to that thing because it kept calling to you, and you found a creative way to put it out in the world that most people might not have necessarily gone down. And the reason you did is in part because you have this first podcast. So, as someone who has recently started podcasting, how has that experience been for you? Because people who listen to this podcast know that I've been doing it for 6 years. So, my comfort level has very drastically changed from the early days, if they've been a part of this journey from the early days. You're still sort of in that newer stage, but you're comfortable enough to say, hey, I'm just going to do a second one. So, how has the process been for you?
I think that the process for me has been fantastic because I already have a natural ability to speak in front of others. I spent several years as an educator. I taught 8th grade English, which is part of the reason why this middle grade fantasy fiction book is so important to me. Because I love that middle grade age of like 4th to 8th grade. And I am just really comfortable sharing my thoughts and ideas. I was in sales for several years, and that gave me a lot of presentation skill set that just continued to develop. And so for me, the most difficult thing has been figuring out things like sound sometimes, or how do I'm editing my own things right now. And so that has been a little bit of a learning curve, but I quickly figured out I'm not going to make perfect the enemy of good. I make it really clear to everyone, listen, I am a writer and I'm an author and I'm the director of marketing of a female-led startup. I am not going to quit my day job to produce a podcast.
Right.
Like it or leave it. And fortunately, I was so touched that about a week or so ago, I'm only like 6 episodes in, and a week or so ago, I got a message on LinkedIn from a young lady that I had not worked with in 3 years. And I only worked with her very briefly at that time. I was coming into a position and she was leaving a position. So we kind of crossed like in a 2-week period, but we connected on LinkedIn and I really enjoyed my time with her. Well, she reached out to me and she said, hey, hope everything's going well. I just want to let you know, I love your podcast. I listen to every episode, which of course there's only been 5, but I was on the way to yoga class and I just started crying. Like I got to yoga and told my instructor, who's one of my good friends, who's actually going to be on the podcast soon. I was like, you're not going to believe what someone said. So that right there to me made it all so worth it, because it can feel scary to put yourself out there. You always wonder, what people are thinking. She's doing a podcast. What possibly does she have to say, or who does she think she is? Well, Who she is someone who really doesn't care what you think of her, because she's going to go for it. So it's given me a lot of confidence, and it has just made a lot of difference. And it hasn't changed my writing. I think a lot of people would think, oh, well, now you're kind of going to write to a greater audience. I'm keeping my writing the same. I have articles planned. I know what I'm writing almost every day. I know what I'm writing unless inspiration strikes and I change my mind.
Sure.
But I definitely feel like I'm getting the opportunity to bring more people in to share the thoughts and ideas I have and share their perspective of it. And to me, I think that's a great gift because it takes an article that I've written from my own perspective, but then it blows it up so much more where it can reach more people.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things I love about your podcast is you talk about something that's really personal to you in some way. But let's face it, we are all going through a very similar, even if it is unique, journey in this human experience. So the people that you have come on can relate to what you're going through, whether they've been through the exact same experience or whether they've had something in their life that just seems similar. And you are able to have sort of this open conversation about, well, I went through something similar, but here's where my view differs, or here's how I handled it differently. And the people who listen have the ability to see it from multiple sides, which I think is just magic.
I hope so. I hope that it's magic. I really also try to intentionally pair the articles with the guests that are coming on. So if I have someone who's interested in coming on, I either have an article that I know would totally resonate with them and it's going to be a great fit, or I know immediately this isn't going to work. And so I'm very intentional about that. I'm very intentional about the types of guests I have on. I'm careful about, if they are perhaps an expert or something, or if they have their own podcast or their own platform they want to promote. I make sure that it's very much in alignment with what my goals are with this podcast, which is to inspire and uplift people. I don't want people to tune in and hear about scaling a business. If I wanted to do a marketing and sales podcast, I have the ability to do that. I could do that for my own company. So this is more about life experiences and navigating your life and living an authentic life in a world that just frankly is really messy, and how you can best do that.
And that, I think, is where a good chunk of the magic comes from, right? Because we do live in this weirdly filtered sort of social media world that is consistently telling us our life should look, pretty and perfect. And so we as human beings start to feel this sort of level of failure if we're not meeting that expectation, right? And so I think it's really important for people like you and people like me to remind everyone, your life is not Kim Kardashian's life, right? Nothing against Kim Kardashian, but most of us don't have an army of people that help us get ready in the morning and that clean our house and that cook our meals. And so because of that, life is messy. Life is chaotic. Things do not always look perfect and pretty. And there is magic in that absolute chaos as well. And it's a matter of figuring out what works best for you as an individual, not what you saw, Crystal figure out or what you saw Jen figure out, but what is it about how Jen navigated it or Crystal navigated it that I can add into my life? And I think that's sort of where a good chunk of all of the magic that we're putting out into the world is coming from. So my question for you, because of that, is how did you get to a place where you were willing to share that? Because for people who listen to this podcast, some of them have already gotten to that place, but some of them are just starting to think like, I have things I want to share with the world, but I'm terrified to do it. So what was that like for you?
Well, I swear, everyone listening, we did not plan this. But the article that I published today is all about that. It's called "The Zone of Genius is the Secret to a Life Lived Well." And I want to read just a little bit of it before I qualify. So the zone of genius is a term that is a Gay Hendricks term from the book, The Big Leap. And actually he has a book now, The Zone of Genius. And I was already kind of tiptoeing towards really going for it as far as getting really deep back into my writing, getting into back into the novel and everything. But I was kind of playing it safe. And there are reasons why people play it safe. So, and I want to read this because it's so close to it. We ignore our zone of genius to fulfill other people's expectations. These expectations are thrust upon us by well-meaning but ignorant people who want the best for us, but people who don't understand that only we can determine what the best for us really means. Add to these expectations the noise of other people around us, people following the rules. Spoiler alert, there are no rules. And maintaining their existence with their daily routines and rituals. They seem happy and satisfied. It makes us think, how much happiness do we deserve? Who are we to decide that we want more happiness or success when we already have so much? Better to keep things easy and average. Average is a security blanket worn by many exceptional people who limit themselves to their own and the world's detriment. So for me, what happened with me is that I was extremely unhappy in the corporate job I had. I had decided that sales, I will win at Cards Against Humanity because I will break all the rules and I will tell you why my card is the best, even though you're not supposed to tell. I'm like, but no, listen, this one is the best. I'm really, really persuasive. I killed it on the LSAT. I could have even gone to law school back in the day. I have all these things that I'm good at. But the one thing that is like breathing for me is my writing. And it's the way I communicate with others. And in a larger scale, it's my ability to connect and communicate with children at some of the most difficult ages. And for me, I ignored that for a long time. But when I started stepping into, I knew I was just not going to be happy continuing the sales route. I decided to take my love of writing and I would just move over into copywriting, more of the marketing world. And copywriting is another thing that I would say that when I'm good at sales, copywriting is what I'm the best at. And Hendricks describes these levels you have of things, your competency levels. I'm great at copywriting. I love it. It's lucrative. I'm so appreciative for the opportunities I had to go freelance, leave a 9 to 5 and copyright. However, as I said in the article, I had leaped, but only to splash in the shallow pool. I knew my potential was much deeper. So I decided to really, really dig into these articles that I was writing. And the articles are for adults, and that evolved into the podcast. And I had multiple story ideas, and there was an adult novel that I was thinking about writing. But when I got into the manuscript that I had started, I just hated these characters. I did not like the adults. I just couldn't find redeemable qualities in them. I'm a very intuitive writer, and the story just did not sit well with me. Mm-hmm. And I thought about how I truly every day tell myself I will write stories that inspire and uplift others. And I thought, what are the stories that feel the greatest to me? And what were the stories that were the greatest to me as a young girl? And they were those stories of adventures, of those kids that could figure it out when the adults were just totally messing it up. And I thought, why wouldn't I just write that story then? And then I remembered that story on the shelf and how much I had adored spending time with those children, those characters that were children. Now I changed it up a little bit. It used to be called Caleb Daniels and the Guardians of Truth, and now it's Stella Daniels and the Guardians of Light. So I've changed some things up, but the premise is still there, that there is so much magic and wisdom in children of this age. They just have to realize where it is in them. And again, that comes back to kids operate in their zone of genius. We do not. So it's almost like the more I dove into this book and this writing, I realized I am in my zone of genius. I am doing my zone of genius. I am dropping it as a podcast. I have a Patreon for it that will happen and all of that, but I'm not doing this to make money. After a certain set number of episodes drop, the book will be published in serial form like the podcast so that kids can hold it and read it for themselves. But what I know is that there are children in the world that they can read all the books in the world, just like I did, but they're cold comfort. There is something valuable about being told a story by an adult that cares about you and the truths that you need to learn as you're young. And so for me, sharing in that way feels like I could not do it. So there's no fear in it, because even if 5 kids listen to it, those are 5 kids' lives that I'm touching.
Oh, so that's beautiful. And I think there's such a great lesson in that, because a lot of times, especially in this social media world that we live in, people get caught up in the numbers and, I only got 20 likes on my photo, or I only, had a reach of, 15 people. But the truth is, if you have one person in the world that you can impact by doing the thing that sets your soul on fire, then hasn't it really been worth it? Because you've changed one life. You've impacted another human being on a deep spiritual level. And ultimately, isn't that sort of what we're all looking for? So I think that's beautiful.
And one thing that I read that I think is really, really vital to think about, 2 things. When it comes to worrying about your likes and everything, people are watching. I don't look at my likes. I look at my engagement. Who saw it? I don't care if they like it. I don't care if they comment. I want to know that they saw it. That's all I'm worried about, because, if they saw that, they're going to look again. And not everyone is going to jump out with a like, but that doesn't mean that you're touching people. And to revert back, as far as like the social media goes, that is another reason why I felt like doing this as a podcast was so important, because I feel like we're raising children. I'm on the tail end. I have a 15-year-old, and frankly, he couldn't care less about TikTok or any of that stuff. He's just not interested. However, I go almost every day when I pick him up at our village Starbucks, Lakewood Village, shout out, Dallas, Texas. And now people know where to kidnap me. Great. But anyway, all the kids walk over there after school and to wait on mom and dad. And I see these girls, and they're in middle school still, just a few years younger than my youngest. And they're all into their Snapchat. They're doing TikTok dances. They're doing all these things, and they're so inundated. And I think TikTok is fun, and I don't have a problem with it. In fact, I'm going to create a TikTok page, God help me, for Stella Daniels in the book. But we're raising tweens in a world where they're inundated with just some really inappropriate and tough messages. And so my idea is, if some of these messages could be better, and I think there are a lot of people trying to do that. I don't think I'm the only one. Sure. But I wrote an article about why I was even writing this, and it was called Raising Tweens in a TikTok World. And I have a pediatrician that's going to come on to my podcast, and we're going to talk about the struggles when it comes to social media. And it's not even really the teenagers. It's that tender age of like between 10 to 12, where boys and girls they're watching the older kids. It comes back to those likes. Yeah. They may not be liking things, but they're watching it and they're finding it. So my goal is hoping that I can put some good media out there for them to find and engage with and like. So
yeah. And have a different perspective. You talk about sort of that 10 to 12 age. And for anyone who understands sort of the developing brain, it is basically at that age, it's a sponge. And it is, whether it's acknowledging it or not, it is picking up on all of the subtle cues, on all of the nonverbal cues, on literally everything in the environment around it. So for that age group, especially, to have something that is more of a guiding force and more of a light in the world, rather than some of this other stuff that we all know as adults, we have a hard time processing. Imagine how hard it is for a 10-year-old to process. I think what you're doing is just magic, and I adore you. So I do want to be respectful of your time. So for everyone who is listening to this podcast and they want to get to know more about you or get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Well, Instagram. I have 2 accounts. I have at Jen Cross Creative. On my Instagram account, I have highlights to a lot of my Medium articles and my podcast episodes. Of course, you can find me on Medium at Jen Cross. I have a Wild and Precious Life that is available on all streaming apps. The other accounts I have would be at Stella Daniels Podcast for Kids. That's for the book. It also has its own streaming account, but it will not be live until January 26th. I'm also on Twitter at JenCross3. I'm just now getting a little active on Twitter. And then Stella Daniels also has a Twitter account. I don't remember what it is right now, but I think it's Stella D Podcast. So perfect. lots of different links. I'll email them to you, Crystal, so you have them all. And
wonderful. And for everyone listening, I will, of course, post them in the show notes and tag on social media and all the fun stuff like I always do, so that you can not only follow Jen, but find out about whatever new and exciting stuff Jen happens to get into come the new year, because, we're recording this in December. It will probably air in January. And if the last couple of years have taught me anything, it's that anything is possible. Everything can happen, even if you don't imagine that it can. So who knows what the new year will bring for any of us?
Absolutely. I just hope it brings wonderful things for everyone listening. Crystal, I just love your podcast. It's one of the many happy moments of my week when I listen to it on my daily walks. And so thank you for what you're doing. I think that it's so important, especially in this post-COVID world or current COVID world, where whatever it is right now, everyone needs a little bit more happiness. And your lessons and your light and your groups on Facebook, I just love it.
Oh, you are fantastic, Jen. Thank you. And thank you to everyone listening. I love and appreciate that you keep coming back week after week. We are in year 6 of the podcast, and that blows my mind every time I think about it, because when I started this, I never thought I would do more than even just one episode. So I love you guys for coming back. I appreciate you, and I hope you all have a magical week. We will chat with you next week. Bye for now.